All right, this lecture is on evolutionary theories in psychology. So the idea here is that the way many of the qualities that we have, or the characteristics that we have that are psychological in nature, um, we have because they were inherited. They were passed down to us from our parents, and the reason that our parents had those qualities is because they were also passed down. So, psychologists have adopted the Darwinian view of evolution, that there are traits and characteristics that provide a survival advantage for a species, and those traits are retained and passed down. So, this lecture reviews applying evolutionary theory to psychology. Um, So after hearing and watching the lecture today, hopefully you'll know what evolution means. You'll understand the primary mechanisms by which evolution takes place. You'll be able to identify the two major classes of adaptations. You'll be able to define sexual selection and its two primary processes, understand psychological adaptations, identify the core premises of sexual strategies theory, and then identify the core premises of error management theory, and then two empirical examples of adaptive cognitive biases. So in this lecture, I'm going to go over the basics of evolution and heredity. I'll then review sexual selection theory, gene selection theory, and then uh, we'll get into the more specifics of what does evolutionary psychology say. And there's two kind of major theories that we would call evolutionary psychology theories. The first is sexual strategies theory, and thus second is error management theory. All right, so here's just some of the basics of evolution, and I'm pretty sure that many of you have been exposed to this in high school classes or previous education. But the basic idea of biological evolution is that populations and species change over time. So, certainly when we think of evolution, we're likely to think of Charles Darwin. In the 1850s, he wrote his influential book on the origin of species, and that's when he proposed um, the idea that species evolve. The mechanism for evolution was natural selection. The idea here is that heritable traits, that is, traits that you can inherit from your parents, that help organisms survive and reproduce, will become more common in a population over time. Okay, so what he proposed is that um, it's organisms that are better adapted to their environment are the ones that survive and the ones that go on to produce more offspring. I reviewed some of this terminology last time, but I'll just go on just as a review. Heredity is just the idea that parents pass on traits to offspring, and a heritable trait is one that is passed on from parents to children by the way of genes. And so that can be physical characteristics. So in human beings, we can talk about height, we can talk about skin color, and eye color, and hair color. Um, in other species, we can talk about the color of a butterfly's wings. With psychology, the interesting and the more controversial idea is that there can be psychological traits that are passed on from parents to offspring. Okay. Now, again, this is mostly an overview of how natural selection works from more of Darwin's idea and these physical characteristics. But I think understanding kind of the basics and using examples from other species with physical characteristics is a good way to be introduced to this idea and to try to understand psychological characteristics. So in this example, you've got a group of mice, and there's variation in their fur color. You've got black fur and you've got tan fur. And they live in an area where the rocks are black. This particular environment has hawks. The hawk likes to eat the mice. But it just so happens they can see the tan mice more easily than the black mice because the tan mice, the fur sticks out, and the black mice, they're more camouflaged. They blend into the rock. Well, because the hawks can see and catch the tan-colored mice more easily, you have a larger number of the tan mice that get eaten, okay? And the black mice don't get eaten. So the black mice are the ones that are able to survive and not get eaten by the hawk, and they're the ones that, because they survive, they go on to reproduce with one another. So after several generations, the idea is you would come to see a particular environment that would be made up of almost exclusively or entirely black mice. And it's because this characteristic that had a survival advantage was passed down. The black fur was passed down from parents to offspring because the parents were the ones that survived. They didn't get eaten. Okay, so that's a basics of how that works. So what ends up getting passed down? So at the broadest level, we can think of organisms, including humans, as having two very large classes or types of adaptations. So one type is survival adaptations. So these would be characteristics that help an organism live and survive in a particular environment. So in this picture, the snow leopard is showing its teeth. It's just intended to say that those teeth are a survival adaptation, as would its claws, because they allow that snow leopard to be a predator and hunt for food, and because of having claws that can catch food, having the teeth that can kill its prey, those are survival adaptations. Okay, as with its fur and its coat, having that rich fur, that thick coat, allows it to survive in the particular environments, cold weather environments. All right, and so in humans, I'll kind of transition just briefly here to the idea of things that are passed down, is we can still think of survival adaptations in humans. And so these would have been characteristics that helped our ancestors to handle things such as food shortages or extremes to temperature, dangerous predators. So having our ancestors that were we've evolved things like preferences for certain kinds of food, like fat and sugar. Okay, and so we've developed that preference because we know if we get some fat, it's highly caloric, that will help us survive. Even evolving things like sweat glands and shivering mechanisms, these would all be things that would have, according to the theory, things that would have evolved because they are advantageous for survival. Okay, if it's too hot, you sweat. If it's too cold, you shiver and you find someplace warmer. Even having a fear of snakes, okay, or a fear of some predator is an evolved psychological adaptation. Okay, people that don't have a fear of snake or a fear of a predator are more likely to get bitten or eaten. So, according to the theory, these would be an evolved adaptation. Now, a second major class of adaptations would be things that help other animals, as well as our own ancestors, in mate competition. Okay. And so the picture here is of the peacock. So the idea here is that having those bright feathers provides an advantage, and in that female peacocks notice the brightly colored feathers of the male peacock. Okay, so that kind of leads us to one of Darwin's main ideas, which is sexual selection theory. So you might say to yourself, why do animals why do they look a particular way? Why does the peacock have these brightly colored feathers? It that wouldn't that would seem to be a problem. Or why does the rooster have this brightly colored red comb on its head? That would seem to be a target for a predator. So Darwin had to explain this, and he said, there's some characteristics that species have, and it's not because of a survival advantage, that is, find food or avoid being food, but because they provide a mating advantage. And that's sexual selection theory. And indeed, the reason that this rooster has this brightly colored red comb is when it bends down to peck for food, that pecking motion and finding food on the ground, uh, a hen can see that from, say, some distance and say, oh, okay, that rooster's found the food. Maybe I'll go get close to that rooster because I can more easily identify. I can see it. So in sexual selection theory, there's two types of competition. So the first is intra-sexual competition. This is the idea that members of the same sex compete with each other, with the winners gaining a mating access to the opposite sex. So male stags, for example, battle with their antlers, and the winner, who is often the stronger one, okay, that had the bigger, stronger set of antlers, is the one that gains access to the female of the species. Okay, it has been suggested that human males will also sometimes compete with each other in physical contests. You can think about boxing or wrestling or martial arts, and with the idea that there's intra, as in within, competition between members of a particular species to gain access to mating access to members of the other gender, or I'm sorry, biological sex. The second process of sexual selection is preferential mate choice. So this is intersexual selection. This is the idea that members of one sex prefer certain qualities in mates. So in this process, if members of one sex prefer certain qualities, such as the bright feathers, signs of good health, those desired qualities get passed on in greater numbers, simply because if you possess that, you have more mating success. So that is, the male peacock that has the brightest feathers is going to have the potential to mate with more females and then pass on this trait. All right, so let's bring this to psychology. And psychological adaptations refer to mechanisms of the mind that have evolved to solve specific problems of survival or reproduction. So what I've depicted right here is two romantic partners, and there seems to be some mistrust or even jealousy going on. And we might say to ourselves, well, jealousy seems like, and even mistrust, it seems like such a negative quality. Why in the world would that be evolutionarily adaptive? Or why would it be, better phrased, why would that be adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint? Like, don't we say that we don't want somebody who's jealous, or what we want is trust? So if that's the case, why is it still around? Okay, if evolution is that characteristics that are adaptive are selected for, why is it the case that in our world we have a psychological adaptation? How can you call it an adaptation when it's negative? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, an evolutionary psychologist would say it actually has some um, uh, reproductive advantage. Okay, so let's think about that. In the first case, if we think about like the jealous girlfriend who's looking over the shoulder, is to say, oh, okay, I don't trust him. Who is he talking to on the phone? Who's he texting with? What are all these messages about? That would be adaptive in the sense that from a strictly from a biological species perspective of wanting to, say, pass on one's genes, what she needs to know is she needs to have parental certainty. And uh, she needs to know that he is going to be around to help take care of an offspring. And if he's talking to or engaged in some other relationships with, um, you know, other women, the idea is that he wouldn't be around to play his role as a father and take care of the offspring, and if the offspring then would have less of a chance to survive. In the right picture, the picture on the right side, same thing. Why would there be this mistrust? Why would there be this jealousy? Here, the male of the species. I should have used parental certainty here in this case. He needs to know that it is his genetic information that is getting passed on and not somebody else's. Okay, so he needs to know that he is whatever offspring will be produced is his and not somebody else's. So that would explain in both cases why we still have things like jealousy, is it all really comes back to wanting to make sure that we pass on our genetic information, and that for in the case of a man can be certain about it's his genetic information that's getting passed on. And in the case of the female of the species, that the offspring that is carrying her genetic information will survive and will be taken care of. Before I talk a little bit more about those ideas, I want to just make the point, as the module does, that psychological adaptations interact with culture. They're culturally specific. So what is considered adaptive in one culture is not necessarily considered adaptive in another. So one specific example would be the difference between what we consider adaptive in the United States versus Japan. So the U.S. is a generally considered an individualistic culture. We value individualism, independence, whereas in Japan, it's a more collectivistic culture, and that what is valued is contributing to the group and having the group accomplish. So highlighting individual accomplishment may be more valuable in the US. And so anything that would signal one's status would be more highly individual status, would have a greater chance of being valued in the U.S. Alternatively, any type of a characteristic that would signal one's willingness to be a part of a group and contribute to the group would be more valued in a collectivistic culture, and so people with those characteristics would be more valued members and have a greater chance at survival and reproduction. All right, so in evolutionary psychology, there's two main theories. The first is sexual selection strategies theory, and the other is error management theory. So sexual strategies theory basically says that humans have evolved a menu of mating strategies, which are selected based on culture, social context, parental influence, and personal mate value. So what this suggests and what it highlights is that men and women have a much different investment when it comes to reproduction. So for men, when it really comes down to it, and again, this is all theory, this is a theory, is that strictly speaking, to reproduce, men have a small investment. They need to pass on their genetic information. they need to pass on their sperm. And that's pretty much the investment. For women, on the other hand, women need to carry the baby for a 9-month period. So they have a much higher investment. And after the baby is born, there's the caretaking of the infant. So, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, sexual strategies theory says that for the male of the species, given a low investment, what a male of the species is looking for is essentially a healthy and viable mate that he knows will carry his offspring and genetic information. For a human females of this female of the species, because of the high investment, what she's looking for are characteristics that would signal the ability to take care of her offspring. Okay. So this has led psychologists to propose that when it comes to choosing sexual partners, men and women value different things. So women should value possession of resources, ambition and industriousness, as well as commitment. Okay, so when it comes to who are women looking for in a partner, it would be any characteristics that signal the ability to take care of her child or offspring. Men, on the other hand, should be interested in characteristics that signal fertility. So youth, health, and attractiveness as all signals of, okay, I have a low investment, I'm trying to pass on my genetic information, and I want to make sure that I'm reproducing with somebody that has the ability to carry my offspring. Okay, so that's the theories based on these differences in the investment to reproduce and then produce an offspring. Men and women should look for very different things. So the question is, okay, that's a theory, but is it true? What research is out there? Well, here's at least some evidence. This was primarily done in the late 80s and early 90s. Researchers asked more than 9,000 adults, 37 different countries, about desirable marriage partner characteristics. Women did end up valuing ambition, industriousness, and earning capacity more than men, and men ended up valuing attractiveness more than women. Okay, so that kind of lines up with the theory in terms of what men versus women say they value. Very important to know is that even though there were those gender differences in the rating for those characteristics, the top characteristics are the same for both men and women. So both men and women say that the things that are at the very top of the list are honesty, trustworthiness, and having a pleasant personality. All right. Now, so what we have here is some evidence, okay, based on men and women valuing different things, that is consistent with evolutionary theory. But if you're a skeptic, and I think you should be, there's, of course, an alternative perspective, which is that gender differences in mate selection are not genetic. They aren't these passed down adaptations, but rather they're socialized. So generally speaking, and especially if we can think about 30 years ago when most of this research was being done, and it is true today as well, unfortunately, women often have less power, status, and wealth than men. So it might not be surprising at all that characteristics such as wealth, ambition, industriousness that would signal that a man would be successful and able to provide, it wouldn't be surprising that those would be valued. So it's really, and it's the case too that if you look at women that are very successful, like female CEOs, when they're interviewed and asked, they many of the characteristics that they say that they value in a male partner are tend to be follow along stereotypically kind of male lines, like attractiveness and the value that are placed on physical attractiveness. So the problem, at least one of the problems with evolutionary theory, is that it's very difficult to disentangle nature from nurture. Um, these kind of evolved gender differences might just be due to dating paradigms as well, um, where men approach and women are approached. So um, part of the reason why we see gender differences in mate selection has nothing to do with evolutionary psychology, and it's all about socialization. So that's important to keep in mind. All right, so that was um, sexual strategies theory. And so let's go to the second one, which is error management theory. Error management theory says that whenever making a judgment in the face of uncertainty, selection will create cognitive biases that function to minimize costly errors. Okay, so the idea here is when we're making a judgment, we have a set of cognitive biases, and where these biases will steer us is to be cautious, to try to avoid errors. Okay, and so one paradigm that this has been studied is something called the visual descent illusion. Okay, so one of these error management theory biases is the idea that people overestimate the distance from the top of a mountain looking down compared to when they're at the top of the mountain, the bottom of the mountain looking up. So in other words, the person that is at the top of the mountain will judge the difference between where they are to the bottom as being much higher than the person who's at the bottom judging up. And the idea here is that people need to be afraid of falling from a great height, because doing so would produce, a lot of harm, injury, and maybe even death. Another good example of this is something called auditory looming bias. So people overestimate how close objects are when the sound is moving toward them compared to when it's moving away. Okay, so when something is approaching, we think that it's closer to us in distance than it is when it's actually that same distance, but it's moving away from us. And again, it has to do with error management theory. We have this evolved mechanism, or the theory goes, we have this evolved mechanism that when something's coming toward us, it could be something that could hurt us. It's better to be safe than sorry. So I better we have these biases that we'll think it's closer when it's coming towards us than when it's moving away. All right. Here's another example of error. So that's kind of a survival, error management theory when it comes to survival, but there's also error management theory that is applied to mating and reproduction. And this is something known as male overperception bias. So consider something as simple as seeing a smile from somebody. It's ambiguous. It could signal that the person's just being friendly or just being nice. It could also signal sexual interest. Okay. Now, according to error management theory, there would be costs to missing out on the chance for reproduction. And so error management theory predicts that men have a sexual overperception bias, and they overestimate sexual interest based on a cue like this, which is based on not wanting to make an error. To say, hey, this is a potential mate. Even if I'm wrong, I don't want to make that error. So if I'm going to lean anyway, I'm going to lean towards it's probably sexually, there's something sexual behind it versus just friendly. Um, and this, in terms of mating, this sexual overperception bias has been demonstrated quite a bit. It's been documented in studies in which men and women will rate the sexual interests of people in photographs and in videotaped interactions. So, generally speaking, um, men more than women overestimate sexual interest based on fairly minimal cues like eye contact and smiling. And the idea would be is that it would confer a mating advantage over other men if they're able to, like you don't want to be wrong. So, um, all right. So that's an overview of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theories in psychology. These tend to be quite controversial. There might have been several things that I mentioned in the lecture that you really didn't agree with, and that would be completely understandable. I'm covering it as a perspective, another biological perspective in psychology, um, and I do hope you know that it is presented merely as theory, as in this is stuff that several psychologists believe in, but really we put theories to the test, and a theory is only a theory until there's a lot of information that supports it. So it is, and it is important to know that it can be very difficult to differentiate evolutionary theories with socialization theories. So even in talking about the male um, overperception bias, while it's consistent with, say, this error management theory of evolutionary psychology, it's also entirely consistent with socialization theories and, say, kind of dating paradigms and what um, traditionally heterosexual males are encouraged and socialized to do in many societies, including ours. So um, I just say that is in presenting this, you should realize that this is being presented as theory and not necessarily as something that would be like a truth about the world. It's merely a way to look at the world. Okay, so hope you know more about evolutionary psychology after listening to this video. Thank you very much for watching.